I'm Gregor Thomson, I'm a philosopher and a writer, and I know what the meaning of life is. Welcome to The Struggle. This episode is brought to you by The Struggle newsletter. This is a weekly email newsletter in which I send out for free every Sunday a short article concerning the art of embracing struggle. If you feel restricted in life, if something is holding you back, perhaps it's time to struggle your way towards freedom. If you're trying to be productive, you're trying to be healthy and to achieve your dreams, perhaps you're chasing the wrong thing. A lot of us believe that we should be aiming for happiness, but this is an unwise pursuit as happiness comes and goes without any control from us. However, there is a way to be more fulfilled with life, and that is to embrace struggle, to exercise, to eat healthily, to have uncomfortable conversations, to take career risks, to discover who you are, and to be autonomous. That's the way to break free from whatever it is that's restricting you. And that's why I created a newsletter. Along with the article, I also provide tips, strategies, and recommendations such as movies, music, podcasts, and recipes to help along the way. To sign up for free, go to gregorthomson.com, the link will be in the show notes, confirm your subscription, and make sure you check your spam folder for your welcome newsletter, and add me to your contacts to continue to receive it in your inbox every week for free. And that's it. You're on your way to struggling more and being more productive, healthy, and motivated. Now, let's get on with the struggle. This is episode 36 of The Struggle with me, Gregor Thomson. And for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to discuss 2 neurotransmitters that are vital to a fulfilling life. Now, I've spoken before about these neurotransmitters, perhaps ad nauseum, but that's because understanding how they work is crucial towards living that fulfilling life that we all want. And the 2 neurotransmitters I'm going to discuss are dopamine and serotonin. Now, last week I spoke about the importance of balancing your day between activities and behaviours that increase dopamine and activities and behaviours that increase serotonin. This is vital because too much of one can cause problems. So we're going to start with dopamine. Now, I just want to preface this episode by saying that the majority of the information, statistics, and studies that I'll be referencing here come from Dr. Anna Lembke's amazing book, Dopamine Nation. I will link the book below. I recommend anyone read it if you're interested in how dopamine works and how dopamine can work against us in the modern world. So let's begin. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and it's responsible for motivation and movement. It is one of the most important neurotransmitters involved in reward processing within the brain. Dopamine motivated our hunter-gatherer ancestors to seek out food, for example, food being the reward. When we receive a reward, our dopamine levels spike. For instance, chocolate increases our output of dopamine by 55%, sex increases it by 100%, and cocaine increases it by 225%. So, when we partake in activities and behaviours that spike dopamine, we are rewarded with pleasure. Scientists have also discovered that pleasure and pain are processed in overlapping brain regions and work in a manner similar to a balance or a seesaw. So when we experience pleasure, the balance tips towards pleasure, and when we experience pain, the balance tips towards pain. However, here's the kicker. The balance yearns to remain balanced. So we can't just chronically be in pleasure. When we experience pleasure, the balance will try to react to that pleasure and try to get back to equilibrium. But it's not always the best at doing this. So with more intense levels of pleasure comes more intense counter levels of pain. As the innovators of the opponent process theory, Richard Solomon and John Corbett said, quote, "Any prolonged or repeated departures from hedonic or affective neutrality have a cost." In other words, there will be an equal and opposite reaction to the pleasure or pain we feel. For instance, eating chocolate provides some pleasure as dopamine levels rise, but following the eating of the chocolate, the balance tips towards pain, which in a lot of cases leads to the eating of more chocolate. Cocaine, for example, spikes dopamine by 225%. However, that spike is very short-lived, and the balance reacts with a swift decline past balance and towards pain. The most significant issue with the pleasure-pain balance is that the more pleasurable an activity or behaviour, the more intense the pain is felt following the behaviour or activity. Hence how addictions are created. Addictions are the perpetual effort to keep the balance tipped towards pleasure and away from pain. Eventually, the pleasure felt diminishes, and some more intense forms of the behaviour are needed. Stronger drugs, more social media, more shopping, more video games, and more intense pornography, to the point in which the pursuit isn't for more pleasure, but for less pain. A heroin user injects heroin, experiences intense pleasure, then as the drug wears off, intense pain, leading to further consumption, leading to addiction. The same can be applied to addictive or compulsive behaviours that we accept or even encourage in Western societies: social media, shopping, gambling, alcohol, and pornography. The fundamental issue that Anna Lembke points out in her book is that the modern world is rife with behaviours and activities that spike our dopamine levels with little to no effort required. Smartphones, television, food delivery apps, video games, online pornography, social media, and online next-day delivery shopping. So is it any wonder why our mental health is deteriorating? Fortunately, there are multiple antidotes, the majority of which involve travelling back to a time in which social media, smartphones, and targeted algorithmic advertising were still to be introduced into our lives. A world in which silence was prevalent, mental space was provided in abundance, and our brains functioned more clearly with the absence of constant, fabricated, and digital distractions. We must therefore sacrifice this modernity. As a species, we have spearheaded technological progress at such speeds, with such impeccable advancement, that we forgot the minor question of what it was all for. We never questioned the implications of such advancement, and unfortunately, the consequences are rearing their ugly heads in the form of deteriorating mental health, increases in suicide, digital addictions, polarization, and more. Sometimes the answer to such complex issues is the simplest one: reverse the progress. Now, I'm not suggesting we get rid of our smartphones and technology and go and live in a cave somewhere meditating 24 hours a day, just that we take time without these distractions. The cure to our diseased modernity is to take a break from it. These digital platforms offer fabricated and exaggerated forms of natural reality, so it's no wonder we're all hooked on them. Why would we want natural reality when we can inject, watch, eat, drink, scroll, or smoke our way towards significant and unnatural spikes in dopamine? So one answer is to, at the very least, take a break from behaviours that unnaturally spike dopamine. These are behaviours in which little to no effort is required to produce the pleasure. The more intense the pleasure, the more cautious we ought to be. Another way to make dopamine work for us rather than against us is to introduce or partake in activities and behaviours that would have spiked our hunter-gatherer ancestors' dopamine, or activities and behaviours that produce pleasure but only after some effort. Exercise, being in nature, eating healthy whole foods, creative endeavours, reading. The reason activities like these make us feel good afterwards is because we are tipping the pleasure-pain balance towards pain, hence why these activities and behaviours require effort. Exercising is painful to an extent, but we feel pleasure afterwards as the balance reacts to the pain felt and tips back towards pleasure. And here's the beautiful part of all of this. The pleasure felt after effort or pain remains high for longer, and it doesn't shoot down dramatically. It teeters off gradually back towards balance. So rather than cocaine causing a fast and short-lived increase in dopamine followed by an intense crash towards pain, when we engage in healthy forms of pain, the pleasure we feel is longer-lived and far less sporadic. For instance, cold exposure or ice plunges can increase dopamine levels by as much as 250%. That's 25% more than cocaine. However, the difference is that the release of dopamine following an ice plunge is prolonged and not short-lived, so you do not experience a crash in dopamine or pleasure. As Dr. Andrew Huberman points out, quote, even short bouts of cold exposure can cause a lasting increase in dopamine and sustained elevation of mood, energy, and focus. And finally, The benefits of pushing on the pain side of the balance in healthy ways regularly can cause your pleasure-pain balance to be naturally tipped towards pleasure. As Anna Lemke points out, quote, with intermittent exposure to pain, our natural hedonic set points get weighted to the side of pleasure, such that we become less vulnerable to pain and more able to feel pleasure over time. We must become aware of our own addictive and compulsive behaviours that tip the balance towards pleasure in fabricated ways with little to no effort required. Otherwise, we risk unnecessary pain in normal life, leading to further consumption of unhealthy activities and behaviours that cause you pain. Therefore, becoming aware of your tendencies to overindulge is the best chance you have of loosening the grip that modernity has on all of us. So to sum up, dopamine is a neurotransmitter responsible for motivation, movement, and reward processing. We feel pleasure as a reward of an action. Pleasure and pain are produced in overlapping brain areas which can simply be thought of as the pleasure-pain balance. When we tip the balance towards pleasure, there is an equal and opposite reaction towards pain. Therefore, if we engage in activities or behaviours that are pleasurable without much effort, we tip the balance towards pleasure, but in time the balance tips towards pain. The more intense the pleasure felt, the more intense the pain that follows will be. So we must be aware of activities that produce pleasure with little to no effort, which are rife in our modern world, such as drugs, social media, video games, gambling, pornography, and junk food. The balance, however, also works the other way. When we tip the balance towards pain, we feel pleasure afterwards. We can leverage this by engaging in effortful and healthy behaviours such as exercising, creating, reading, going outside into nature, and cold exposure, which tips the balance towards pain as we work, and the balance reacts and tips towards pleasure following the behaviour. However, instead of the pleasure being short-lived, as with cocaine, the pleasure felt is prolonged and sustained and decreases gradually rather than suddenly. As much as dopamine is vital to living a fulfilling life, it's not the whole picture. If we chronically produce dopamine, albeit in healthy ways, we run the risk of constantly working and thinking about the future without being grateful and appreciating the present, as well as experiencing the present moment for all it is. And that's where serotonin comes in, which we'll discuss next week. But for now, the answer lies in the struggle. So keep on struggling. Just a few more things before you take off. Firstly, thank you for watching. It genuinely means a lot to see people viewing and liking the content. Second, if you're enjoying the content, please subscribe and share. Those are the best ways you can support the podcast. As you can probably tell, I don't have a ton of fancy equipment. I don't have a team behind me helping with marketing or editing the podcast. I don't have much resources. So any help is greatly appreciated. You can also stay up to date with everything I'm doing on social media. All of the links will be in the show notes. And you can also listen to the Struggle podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And lastly, keep on struggling.